Shalom, I'm Mike Garinespan. For the next half hour, we'll be posing and attempting to answer some of the questions that Jews ask. Joining me today are Professor Rביצקי. He's professor of Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem and an outstanding spokesman for moderate orthodoxy. And Professor Yehуда באואר. He's the head of the Hebrew University's Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. He's also past chairman of the Israel Movement for Humanistic Judaism. Orthodoxy, humanism. They're just two of the terms likely to come into question here today as we make a first attempt to decide and define who is a Jew, what is a Jew, or if you will, what makes a Jew. That question is becoming more and more difficult to answer. Until a couple of centuries ago, we could have relied on the almost universal religious commitment and traditional lifestyle of Jews almost everywhere to give us a clear-cut answer. But today, when observant Jews may define themselves as Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, or Reconstructionist, not to mention a host of subdivisions, the answer is somewhat harder to find. And then there are those non-religious Jews who still maintain Jewish customs, or for whom Jewishness derives from identification with the Jewish people or the land of Israel. Consider the Jewish identity of any one Jew, and you're almost bound to discover that it combines several of these elements, which makes clear-cut definitions that much more elusive. Professor באואר, in Jewish terms, is there really such a thing as a secular Jewish identity? And if so, what is it?
It didn't exist, as you pointed out rightly, I think, 2 centuries ago. But with the increasing secularization of the Western world, a sociological fact has come about that over half of the Jewish people simply do not observe religion. So they are secular. They identify themselves as Jews. The question, therefore, is there a possible interpretation of Jewish culture and tradition that, while emphasizing the importance of religion, does not define itself only in terms of religion, but in terms of a culture and a civilization? In other words, a historical interpretation. I am the result of a Jewish civilization of thousands of years ago, and I'm not going to give up that identification to rabbis.
Okay, an historical interpretation, you say. But Professor Rביצקי, I think you'll agree with me that traditionally the interpretation hasn't been historical, it's been religious. A Jew is defined in religious terms. It's an all-encompassing, holistic kind of approach. So isn't the notion of a secular Judaism, a secular Jewish identity, somewhat of a contradiction in terms?
First of all, it's not my definition. I recognize Yehуда באואר as a Jewish person, and he doesn't need my legitimization. On the other hand, if you ask me if a secular Jew is a complete, whole, perfect Jew, I don't think so, but I also do not think that the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist Jew is a complete, whole Jewish person. But I wouldn't say that the only exclusive classical definition of Judaism is religious. It's some sort of a combination between the religious element and the element of peoplehood. Try to examine, for instance, the fact that theological schemes within Judaism didn't break us into different nations and peoples as they did, for instance, within Christianity. I don't think that the debate today between the secular and the ultra-Orthodox is less deep than the debate between the Protestant and the Catholic, between the Sunni and the Shia in the Islam. So why is it that we still feel as brothers and sisters? It seems that in addition to the religious factor, there is a national factor. So it's only the combination of both elements together which makes us Jewish. I feel that Yehуда באואר misses something, but he's Jewish.
Well, we're saying then that the lines of definition are already less than 100% clear. Let's try to sharpen them a bit. Professor באואר, let's try to look at secular Jewish identity and compare it not to Orthodox Judaism with its hard and fast definitions of what one needs to do to be a Jew, but let's compare it to the more liberal streams, especially the most liberal Reform Judaism. Other than belief in God, how would you say that secular Jewish identity differs from religious Jewish identity?
In terms of reform, I think there is indeed very little difference. because in the Reform movement, the concept of God is not very clear. They do believe, they are a deeply religious community. I do not share that religious commitment. But apart from that, and it is not terribly well defined in the Reform movement, there's very little that differentiates me from the Reform. I would put it in a kind of a paradoxical way. In the Reform congregations in the United States, most of the rabbis, by no means all of them, are Reform. Some of them are secular. Most of the people who visit Reform synagogues waver between Reform and secular and can be found on either side of the divide. So in fact, one kind of attitude moves into another, and the wider the gap is, let's say, between a secular Jew who considers himself as or herself as the heir of Jewish tradition in a secular interpretation, and let us say a very Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jew, there you will find the difference is growing. So it's not a clear divide, it's a transition, more of a transition from one to the other.
May I make a comment? I agree with you only partially. With regard to the comparison between your concrete way of life and the concrete way of life of the average Reform Jew, I agree with you. But theologically speaking, I believe that you are closer to me than to the Reform rabbi. Why? There were two types of normalization, so to speak, towards the end of the 19th century. One was the secular Zionism. Secular Zionism wanted a normalization of the Jewish people. A normal people is a people and not a religion. Reform Judaism wanted to normalize Jewish religion. They claimed a normal religion is a religion only and not a nation. So from the point of view of the theology of Reform Judaism, Judaism is only a religion and theology, and you are supposed to be outside as a secular Jew. From my point of view, since Judaism is both, includes in it both the national identity and the religious identity, you are still Jewish.
Yes, but you see, there's a difficulty there. You are looking at the Reform movement in terms of history. Now that's very important, that's where it comes from. But Reform Judaism today no longer has these ideas.
I agree.
Reform Judaism today has joined, at least in its majority, at least in theory, the Zionist movement. So the differences are getting weaker, and what we find is that a very very high proportion of Jews do not identify with any of the religious streams. If there is no legitimate way of interpreting Jewish tradition in a secular way, then indeed we have lost over half of the Jewish people. If there is, and I would maintain that there is a legitimate, I would even say traditional way of interpreting Judaism in a secular way, then there is still hope that we may not lose over one half of the Jewish people.
Later on, we'll try to focus in on some questions that deal specifically with the Jewish experience, both religious and secular, here in Israel. But the subject we're dealing with now, and you're referring to very directly, is what happens to Jews out there in the big old world, in the diaspora, especially in the places where they live in free societies, where they are no longer compelled by external threats to remain Jewish or to be reminded of the fact that they're Jewish, where they are given every invitation, every possibility of joining the secular society, of assimilating in any way they see fit. They have freedom, and that freedom can be, as you indicated, a dangerous thing when we talk about continued Jewish existence. In those open societies, and I ask the question to both of you, what are the obligations and the parameters of Jewish commitment?
Okay, before I answer your question, I would like it to be very clear that I spoke about Reform Judaism only regarding its historical origins, the origins of its theology. Secondly, I would like Yehuda Bauer to very much to succeed in his effort to develop a secular definition, a deep, traditional, secular definition of Judaism, because when I confront the present situation, when more than 50% of the Jewish people is not observing. I don't want them to assimilate, and I would like him to succeed. I am a little reluctant regarding the possibility to transform it into future generations. But certainly, I would like you to succeed.
Again, though, when we're talking about a world where A, there's freedom of choice, and B, other than within the ultra-Orthodox stream, most Jews have a personal and religious freedom of choice. How do you do that? How do you define the commitment that it takes to remain a Jew given this situation?
I think the commitment is voluntary. In past centuries, we had a situation where the Jew had to, if he didn't want to leave Judaism altogether, which was a possibility, at least in the Christian and Muslim world, he was forced into a certain way of life, which he accepted. It's not, by force, I don't mean that each individual had to be forced into it. No, they accepted it, they wanted it.
In some cases,
Today,
he was ghettoized psychologically.
In all cases. I mean, a Jew was born a Jew and remained a Jew because he was a Jew. But I think that the important thing there is that today the commitment is voluntary. You can be a 1 or 2 day Jew a week. The rest of the week, 5 days or 6 days, you are within a non-Jewish society. So it's basically a question of a will to maintain an identity. And from that point of view, whether a person goes into a synagogue and prays and observes kashrut and does not ride on a Shabbat and so on and so forth, or whether he doesn't do all these things or does the opposite of what he should be doing if he were a religious Jew, but maintains an identity in other ways. For instance, there are, in fact, secular synagogues in existence with people even who have the titles of rabbis. But even without that, they meet on the Shabbat or on another day. They learn Jewish traditions. They wish to identify with Jewish traditions in the sense of values, of morals, and so on and so forth. And they belong to Jewish communities. The Jewish communities they maintain will be as distinct as Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox.
Over time, is that kind of orientation strong enough, stubborn enough?
That's what he said.
Yeah,
that's what he asked.
Yeah. I believe you ignore, Yehuda, the fact that most of American Jewry, when they identify themselves as Jews, they do it in light of different religious institutions, trends, and phenomena. What they share is an effort to behave religiously. In most day schools, perhaps all of them, in America or in Europe, they pray, they daven in the morning as a symbol of their Jewish identity, and they don't have so many symbols as a secular Jew can have here.
When that child in a Sunday school or a day school prays in the morning, and then when he gets to the age of 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, he abandons that, then obviously this doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's a failure. What we have to do is to replace, for people who want it, by all means. I mean, I'm the last person to want to propagandize against religion. But I think it's very important to present an alternative.
What is the alternative?
Now, the alternative is the non-religious elements in Jewish culture. If you have the
And let's confine ourselves to the diaspora for a second.
Yeah, sure. I'm talking only of the diaspora.
Okay.
Because it is in the diaspora that, as Avi rightly pointed out, there are all these different religious trends which are splitting the Jewish people today. Religion, far from being a uniting factor, it is a factor that divides us. So this cannot form the basis of a common Jewish identity. Question whether in 3 generations my kind of a solution will produce a Jew. But you see, I am by no means certain that the solutions of the religious streams will produce Jews in 3 generations.
Let's be specific. What is your solution, in a nutshell?
The solutions,
obviously,
let us say, is to keep Jewish festivals, to keep Jewish traditions, but exclude from them elements that are purely theistic without changing the text.
That's what you call Jewish humanism?
I would call Jewish secular humanism, for me, is an attempt to see the Jewish tradition and interpret it in a non-religious way without changing the text.
And without
the
God?
humanistic, just a moment, the humanistic element is to take those elements in Judaism that fit our contemporary humanistic agenda and emphasize those.
But you're talking about doing all these things with the exclusion of belief in God.
For people who don't believe in God, yes, certainly. But you see, it's not only a question of belief in God,
Yeah.
it's a question of whether the belief in God is relevant. In other words, there can be a person who will say, yes, I believe in something up there, but I don't think it's relevant to my life. I would exclude him in my kind of a Jew. You see, the definitions are our invention. Definitions are abstractions from reality. What I'm much more concerned with is the content behind the definition. And therefore, whether you define me as a secular Jew or not is really unimportant. It's a question whether the religious belief is relevant to the life of the individual as he lives it.
It's also a question of the historical context. Don't you ignore the fact that in contradistinction to the identity of the French people, of the British people, here you speak about a people, and it's an historical fact, positive or negative, whose almost the whole culture and creativity was based upon religion when the concept of God stood in the center. For instance, if I teach Jewish philosophy, it goes without saying that until the last few generations I teach religious Jewish philosophy. If I was a professor of Jewish folklore, of Jewish literature, of Jewish dancing, of Jewish music, I would teach religious creativity. So the effort to secularize all these and to preserve its content, its attraction, its taste, I'm very doubtful if you're going to succeed. Again, I want you to succeed because I prefer a secular, traditional Jew and a person who is going to assimilate. But I'm very doubtful.
Obviously, both of you are defining a struggle that exists and will continue to exist for the foreseeable future, a struggle, however, that is relatively confined to the diaspora, in which the possibility of assimilation exists, in which people want to define a new, modern, relevant, contemporary Judaism, and at the same time take the steps necessary to make sure that people don't begin to disappear as Jews because what they're creating ends up being so similar with the mainstream secular lifestyle. I'm oversimplifying, I realize, but I think that's the danger, in a sense, that intersection between the secular and the religious. Let's transfer our discussion for a second to the confines of this particular country of Israel, a Jewish country in which the national lifestyle just happens to be, or doesn't just happen to be, a Jewish lifestyle, in which the Jewish holidays are the national holidays, in which you or I can send our children to school knowing that they'll come home, even from the most secular of public schools, with something that resembles what we might call a Jewish religious education if we were talking about the diaspora, learning Torah, learning biblical history, learning customs and traditions, etc. Does that guarantee the viability of Jewish identity here in Israel, the very fact that we have this external situation that makes it easier, if you will, to be a Jew here?
I don't think so. I don't think there is any guarantee of that. I think that there is a penetration into Israeli society of absolutely valueless cultural phenomena from the Western world, which tend to destroy the identification with a continuation of Jewish tradition and Jewish values. I'm speaking as a secular Jew. So when the children come back from school having learned some chapter in the Bible, that does not guarantee anything. I think that what needs to be done, and here I'm critical of the secular education in Israel, it does not introduce secular Jewish values, which would mean to give a content to the things that are learned by rote in schools, and which make youngsters, when they leave school, hate the stuff that they learned. I mean, Jewish history is a fascinating thing. And here, many of us teach or have been taught, I'm also the product of an Israeli secondary school, that the Jews were either persecuted or wrote important books. I mean, there's much more to it than that. And instead of making this a fascinating live subject, we kill it. Religious education is something else. Avi will be more expert on talking about that here. But I think that we must introduce Jewish secular values into Jewish secular schools.
Avi?
Yeah, I agree. Since I don't believe in historical determinism, nothing is guaranteed. But I would say that my criticism is directed to both sides. On the one hand, I don't think that the only problem within the secular educational system is secular values. It's the knowledge of Jewish history, Jewish texts, Jewish creativity. You know, even the language becomes so shallow when some of your students do not have all the connotations from Maimonides, from Halevi, from classical poetry, from the Midrash. On the other hand, I think that within the Orthodox system, you don't expose the students enough to the outside world, to the modern Zionist revolution, to modernity. So we really confront a serious problem.
Let me ask you both to go a step further on exactly that level. We've talked about the problems of education for secular Jews to teach them Jewish values. We've talked about the fact that Orthodox Jews are moving further and further away from the real life of the nation. In this country, Orthodox and secular Jews, especially, let's say, ultra-Orthodox and secular Jews, find themselves more and more at loggerheads in recent years. They're in conflict over the question of service in the army. Many of the ultra-Orthodox don't go. The secular Jews do go. That great melting pot, which could potentially make the two groups come closer together, doesn't exist for them as a shared phenomenon. They are at loggerheads in politics. We see it in these days as religious parties and secular parties wrangle over political power. They're in conflict over funding for religious institutions. Are we witnessing the development of two Israels, two societies that are irrevocably moving apart from one another?
I would like to try to respond. You know, historically there was a political status quo between the different camps, which was also a social contract. And it was efficient for almost 30 years. And we all agree, I believe, that it's not efficient anymore. And there are different explanations to it. But I would like to underline one of them. I believe that historically, the famous status quo or social contract was based upon a false common denominator between the two groups. And this false common denominator was that each one believed that the other one is going to die, disappear, become weaker and weaker. So why shall I fight him if in any case I am going to get your grandchildren? We tend to be very tolerant towards a dying person or towards a dying group.
Hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened, and now, and I believe it's a positive factor. I believe that the battle today reflects a positive factor. Now, each camp and each group is aware of the fact that the other one is going to stay here, to have grandchildren, to create, to write, to be vital. So now we have the real Zionist challenge. It's not only, human challenge of tolerance. It's a Zionist challenge. For 19th centuries, we were used to say, we could preserve ourselves as one people despite the fact that we were widespread all over the globe. But there is a danger that we'll be able to say after a few generations, we were one, not despite of the fact that we were widespread, but because we were widespread. Zionism brought us together in a distance of stone throwing with different ideologies. This is a challenge now.
Yehuda, let me throw the last question to you and ask you to be somewhat brief because we're nearing the end of our time. Jews in Israel, two different strains, coexisting, not always happily, but each one with its own strength of existence. How about Jews in Israel as opposed to Jews in the rest of the world, especially when we're talking about the development of a kind of, if you will, an Israeliness in terms of a lifestyle, with the emptiness perhaps, with some of its own values in addition, as opposed to the kind of Jewish identity that is experienced by both religious Jews here and abroad? Are Israelis in that modern secular sense bound to move away from Jews in a more general sense?
If they want to commit suicide, yes. I think that the only way of a survival of a Jewish culture, secular or not, in this country, is to maintain and develop its connections with the Jews abroad, and vice versa. Now, the fact that the lifestyles are different, that the problems that the societies face are different, has been with us historically from time immemorial, because Jews lived in completely different societies before. The point is not that. The point is there an underlying identification with traditions and with attitudes and with values that bridge over the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or whatever?
Your gut feeling, is
Yes.
there or isn't there?
I think it doesn't have to be a gut feeling, because this has been examined. Yes, there is an identification. Yes, there is a minority that does not feel so identified.
Avi Revitsky, in a word, will things continue this way? Will we continue to exist as a coherent people?
I believe we will, but I believe I disagree with Yehuda Bauer on one point only, and it is that if he succeeds totally in the process of the secularization of the Israeli society, it will contribute to the suicide that he would like to prevent.
Professor Avi Revitsky and Professor Yehuda Bauer, both of you from Hebrew University, thanks very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
What or who is a Jew? What makes a Jew? That's the question we've been struggling with today, and obviously the answer is far from close at hand. This and other issues form the basis for continuing discussion and debate within our community and on upcoming programs in this series. Our thanks to Professors Avi Revitsky and Yehuda Bauer. Join me again next time for more of the questions Jews ask. From Jerusalem, I'm Mike Greenspan. Shalom.